Hello everyone. Today we have a new lesson. The lesson is about weak forms. What are strong and weak forms in the English language? Some common words in the English language have two forms. A strong form and a weak form. The strong form is used when the word is stressed. The weak form is used when it's not. Function words have both strong and weak forms in English. A lot of function words have both strong and weak forms. As a rule, the weak form turns the vowel to be muted. For example, take a look at this sentence. Below are some function words that you can remember. Let's start with auxiliary verbs like am, are, be, been, can, could, do, does, has, had, shall, should, was, were, would. Prepositions like at, for, from, of, to. Pronouns like he, her, him, his, me, she, them, us, we, you. Conjunctions like for, and, but, or, than, that. Articles like a, the, an. Many function words have two pronunciations, a strong form and a weaker reduced form. The strong form has a full vowel and is used only for emphasis or at the end of a sentence before a pause. Why are weak forms hard to hear? Because they are not stressed in a sentence, shorter, pronounced quickly, not pronounced clearly. Some sounds disappear completely. Vowel often changes to schwa sound Vowel reduction means that the strong vowel sounds are reduced to an or sound, schwa or short I sound, when they are unstressed. U becomes y. U is a strong form. Y is a weak form. Your becomes your. Your is a strong form. Your is a weak form. To becomes t. To becomes t. Or becomes Or becomes Can becomes kin. Can becomes kin. A becomes A becomes unless it's before a vowel. To becomes t. For becomes fur. At becomes it. And becomes or becomes You becomes y. Him becomes m. Have becomes if. Can becomes kin. Do becomes d. To becomes t. For becomes fur. On becomes A becomes An becomes Or becomes Or becomes You becomes y. The before a consonant sound becomes the. And becomes an or in. Have becomes of. Of becomes of or a. Him becomes im. He becomes e. Her becomes er. Am becomes m. Are becomes er. Can becomes kin. Could becomes kid. Do becomes d. Does becomes does. Had becomes had. Has becomes his. Have becomes have. Must becomes must. Shall becomes shall. Should becomes should. Was becomes was. Were becomes were. A becomes a. An becomes an. The becomes the. At becomes it. For becomes fur. From becomes from. Of becomes of. To becomes t. And becomes and. But becomes but. Then becomes then. Or becomes nor becomes ner. Her becomes her. Them becomes them. Us becomes us. Your becomes your. Some becomes some. That becomes that. For becomes fur. At becomes it. As becomes is. With becomes with. On becomes un. From becomes from. To becomes t. In becomes un. Of becomes a. Can becomes kin. Could becomes k or kid. Would becomes wa or would. Should becomes sh or should. Will becomes wool. Must becomes must or must. Shall becomes shall. Because becomes cause. But becomes b or but. So becomes s. And becomes un. Or becomes Her or her. You can pronounce it her or her. Her becomes I like her. Like her. I like her. Herself or herself. You can pronounce it herself or herself. Becomes herself. Becomes again herself. She lives by herself. Herself. She lives by herself. Them becomes Tell him I am busy. Tell him. Tell him I am busy. Us becomes us. Us becomes us. Please help us. Us. Please help us. Us becomes us. Make us short and reduced. Us. Please help us. Make it short. Us. At becomes it. The movie starts at 8. The movie starts at 8. At 8. At becomes it. About. About. Tell me about it. About. It's wrong to pronounce it about. It's not a. About it. For becomes fur. This gift is for you. For you. This gift is for you. For becomes fur. Of becomes of. He's in front of me. He's in front of me. Front of. He's in front of me. Of becomes of. To becomes t. To becomes t. She's going to school. She's going to school. To school. She's going to school. To school. To becomes t. Can becomes can. I can do it. Can do it. Could becomes could. The accident could have been avoided. Could have been avoided. Does becomes does. What does she do? Does. What does she do? Does becomes does. Had becomes it. The current had it. The current had it. Had becomes it. Have becomes if. Where have you been or been? Where have you been or been? So have becomes if. Should becomes should. You should have told me. You should have told me. You should. You should have told me. Should becomes should. Was becomes was. It was a good idea. It was a good idea. It was a good idea. Would becomes would. Would you believe it? Would you believe it? Would becomes would. Would becomes would. The becomes the. The police. The car. The police. The car. Are becomes Kids kids are. Those those are becomes and becomes on. Thursday on Friday. On you. And becomes on. Thursday on Friday. Of becomes a after a consonant. One. Part. Of becomes a after a consonant. A becomes a. An becomes an. A break. A meeting. By the way, you can pronounce it meeting or meeting. Flap T. A becomes a break. A break. A meeting. A meeting. And becomes an. To becomes t. To see, go to. To see, go to. To see, go to. Go to. Go to. To becomes t. To see, go to. Was becomes was. Was late, was awesome. Was becomes was. Was late, was awesome. Was. That becomes that. That's terrible. That might. That becomes that. That's terrible. That might. That might. That becomes that. For becomes fur. Fur dinner. Fur bed. For becomes fur. Fur dinner. Fur bed. Fur. You becomes y. New ya. New ya. Do ya. New ya. Do ya. You becomes y. At becomes it. It six. It work. It six. It work. At becomes it. It. But becomes bit. But becomes bit. Bit that. Bit its. But becomes bit. Bit that. Bit its. His becomes is. It's his. It's his. That's his. That's his. His becomes is. It's is. It's his. That's is. That's his. From becomes from. From. From becomes from. From. From 1 to 4. From New York. From becomes from. From. From 1 to 4. From New York. By the way, you can pronounce it New York or New York. Or becomes Or becomes Tuesday Thursday. 3 4. Or becomes Tuesday Thursday. As becomes is. As becomes is. Not is. Not is. Not is. As soon as. As soon as. As soon as. As becomes is. There becomes there. There becomes there. Their address. Their house. There becomes there. Their address. Their house. Can becomes can. I can. We can. Can becomes can. Then becomes then. Then becomes then. More than. Better than. By the way, you can pronounce it better. More than. Better than. Then becomes then. Then becomes then. Our becomes our. Our becomes our. Our house. Our best. Our becomes our. Our house. Our best. Our becomes our. طبعا الدرس بتاعنا النهارده بيتكلم عن حاجه اسمها الويك فورمز اللي هي المقاطع الضعيفه. زي ما احنا عارفين ان في كلمات في اللغه الانجليزيه بنسميها فانكشن ووردز. الكلمات دي لها نطقين، نطق قوي ونطق ضعيف. الويك فورمز عندنا لازم نكون عارفينها عشان واحنا بنتكلم بشكل سريع نعرف نستخدمها صح. مثلا الاكسيلري فيرب ام الويك فورم بتاعه المقطع الضعيف بتاعه از بتبقى از، ار بتبقى دو بتبقى د، does بتبقى does، have بتبقى if، has بتبقى is، had بتبقى id. هنا برضو نفس الكلام، عندنا الويك فورمز، عندنا المقاطع الضعيفة. am بتبقى are بتبقى can بتبقى can، could بتبقى could، do بتبقى the، does بتبقى does، had بتبقى had، has بتبقى his، have بتبقى have، must بتبقى must، shall بتبقى shall، should بتبقى should، was بتبقى was، were بتبقى were. عندنا هنا برضو كلمات function words، كلمات لها مقاطع ضعيفة weak forms، زي a بتبقى am بتبقى on، the بتبقى the، at بتبقى it، for بتبقى for، from بتبقى from، of بتبقى if، to بتبقى to. عندنا هنا برضو function words، كلمات وليها weak forms، كلمات وليها مقاطع ضعيفة. and بتبقى and، but بتبقى but، then بتبقى then، or بتبقى nor بتبقى nor، her بتبقى her، them بتبقى them، us بتبقى us، your بتبقى your، some بتبقى some، that بتبقى that، طبعا الحاجات دي عاوزة شوية تدريب كتير وعاوزة ممارسة على قد ما تقدر.